My name is Serafina, I am 28 years old, and no matter how many years of quiet silence I try to wrap around my soul, I spend every waking hour fighting to incinerate the memory of the night my family left me on the side of a flooded country road like a pile of rotting weeds. The trauma does not fade with the turning of the calendar, it remains branded into my consciousness like a branding iron on raw leather. It was 11:30 p.m. in the middle of a torrential autumn downpour in the valley, the kind of freezing mountain gale that turns the dirt paths into treacherous rivers of mud and drives icy rain through layers of thick clothing, like thousands of tiny glass needles. I was standing on the slick, gravel driveway of the Emerald Hills homestay, shivering uncontrollably in nothing but a damp linen tunic and bare feet. In my arms, I held my 4-month-old son Toby, who was crying a weak, suffocating cry, his tiny lungs laboring against the bitter, freezing wind due to a severe, newly diagnosed respiratory allergy. Just seconds before the cold consumed us, my mother-in-law Rosamond had marched out onto the covered wooden porch of the main cabin. Her face was contorted into an expression of pure, generational malice as she grabbed my son's specialized medical air purification unit and his custom organic nebulizer kits, the highly sensitive equipment I had purchased to keep his fragile breathing passages from collapsing, and hurled them directly into the dark, mud-slicked drainage ditch below. I watched in absolute, paralyzed horror as the plastic casings cracked against the jagged rocks, their clinical filters and sterile solution washing away into the rushing, muddy rainwater. "Take your sick, defective burden and clear off this property," Rosamond had shrieked, her voice pitched to a sharp, theatrical frequency that easily pierced the howling valley wind. "We are officially finished harboring a broke, low-class mud-scratcher who brings nothing but the smell of fertilizer, wet dirt, and endless financial embarrassment into this luxury resort." Beside her stood Julian, my husband of 4 years and the newly promoted managing director of Emerald Hills, a boutique eco-homestay that had recently become the most lucrative tourist destination in the region. He did not flinch. He did not raise a single hand to shield his freezing, fragile son from the biting rain, nor did he look at the shattered medical equipment drowning in the ditch. Instead, his handsome features were set in a cold, calculating sneer that made him look like an absolute stranger. He reached into his tailored waterproof jacket, pulled out a thick leather portfolio, and shoved it hard against my wet chest. The heavy legal document, instantly soaked by the freezing rain, began to warp and tear under my trembling fingers. "Those are divorce papers, Serafina," Julian said, his voice entirely flat, stripped of a single ounce of human warmth or shared history. "I am done. I am absolutely done playing house with a broke gardener from the industrial greenhouses who works in raw manure and muddy shovel blades. You sit around this property pretending to plant flowers while I pull 80-hour weeks securing the elite city investors and travel agency contracts that keep this homestay at the pinnacle of the hospitality world. I refuse to let a parasitic laborer drag my corporate reputation through the dirt any longer. Walk away now, or I will have the local sheriff trespass you off this mountain." Before I could even find the breath to plead for our son's life, Julian reached out, gripped my shoulder, and shoved me roughly backward onto the wet gravel driveway. He stepped back inside the warm, cedar-scented light of the grand reception lobby, and slammed the heavy oak door directly in my face. I heard the heavy iron deadbolt click into place with an agonizing, final metallic snap. They truly believed they were discarding a helpless, destitute nobody who had absolutely nowhere to go. They thought they had executed the perfect corporate and personal eviction, clearing the path for Julian's dazzling new future with the wealthy elite investors from the city. What their greedy, small-minded brains did not know was that in exactly 10 days, their entire reality would shatter, and the very foundation of their multi-million-dollar homestay would be reclaimed by the woman they had just thrown into the storm. Before I reveal how I dismantled their entire world, let me know where you are watching this story from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a toxic, arrogant family who systematically underestimated your worth. Growing up, my life was defined by the rich, earthy scent of damp soil, the complex chemistry of botanical nutrients, and the quiet growth of rare flora that filled my grandfather's small organic nursery in the valley. My grandfather had spent 40 years teaching me the intricate science of landscape architecture, how to design natural drainage systems, how to curate microclimates that allowed exotic plants to thrive without synthetic chemicals, and how to read the topography of the land to maximize its structural value. I was proud of our trade. But to the prestigious family of my husband, my background was an unforgivable stain on their pristine social record. Julian and I had met 4 years ago when he was desperately seeking an independent landscape designer to stabilize a collapsing terraced slope that threatened to bury the foundation of his primary guest cabin. I saved his property from catastrophic structural failure, and back then, his intense ambition had seemed charming. But once we married, that ambition rapidly mutated into a toxic, magnifying obsession with social status, fueled entirely by his mother Rosamund. Rosamund was a tyrannical matriarch who measured human worth strictly by the pedigree of one's family lineage and the price tag of the luxury brands they wore. Because I chose to run my independent landscape design and sustainable agriculture consulting business from a modest greenhouse workshop wearing simple work clothes, I was her ultimate disappointment. To her, I was just a low-class, hired hand leeching off her brilliant, corporate climbing son. The nightmare had reached a tipping point immediately after I brought our baby boy, Toby, home from the hospital. He had been born with a severely compromised respiratory system and an extreme case of environmental allergen hypersensitivity, requiring a strictly monitored, dust-free environment. You would think the arrival of a beautiful, fragile grandson would soften even the coldest of hearts. Instead, it only exposed the absolute rotting, sociopathic core of the household. Julian complained endlessly that Toby's soft whimpering and the hum of his medical air filtration unit ruined his sleep before his high-stakes marketing meetings. Rosamund visited our wing of the property daily, not to offer a single hand of help, but to inspect my housekeeping with judgmental, white-gloved fingers, whispering venom into Julian's ear about how my botanical research bills and lack of active financial contribution were draining the family's prestigious reserves. It all boiled over on that fateful, freezing evening. The local news had been blasting severe flash flood warnings since dawn, advising residents to stay indoors as the river rose and temperatures plummeted. I was in the greenhouse laboratory wing, desperately trying to soothe a congested, feverish Toby while recovering from my own difficult postpartum complications. The front doors flew open, and Julian marched in with Rosamund trailing close behind. They did not even bother to remove their muddy, wet designer boots. They stomped directly onto the hand-woven linen rug I had spent months carefully dye-testing and weaving, leaving thick, brown streaks of mountain mud across the delicate fibers. I looked up, my heart sinking as I felt the immediate, violent shift in the room's atmosphere. Julian held the thick leather folder like a weapon, and Rosamund's face carried a look of triumphant, sickening joy. I quietly asked them to keep their voices down, explaining that Toby had only just settled after hours of struggling to breathe. Rosamund let out a sharp, mocking laugh that echoed coldly off the vaulted ceiling. "This is my son's estate, you pathetic freelancer," she snapped, marching directly into my personal space. "He can speak however he pleases in his own home. You, on the other hand, need to pack up your rags and get out of this house right now. The divorce papers are finalized, and Julian is officially extracting himself from this parasitic marriage." I stood frozen, clutching Toby tightly against my chest as Julian shoved the papers against me. I begged him to listen to reason. I pointed out the window, where the rain was turning into a blinding sleet, and reminded him that his own son was far too fragile to survive even a minute of exposure to the freezing wind. I pleaded with him to let us stay in the guest cottage until morning so I could find a safe, warm place for Toby. Julian merely stared at me with cold, dead eyes. "Go find a public shelter for all I care," he muttered, grabbing my arm and shoving me toward the door. "You are no longer my financial liability." Now, standing on the frozen concrete of the driveway, the sheer terror of immediate survival crashed over me with the force of an avalanche. Toby's cries were growing weaker by the second, his tiny lips turning a terrifying, pale shade of blue under the stinging rain. I knew that if I did not find warmth and shelter within the next 10 minutes, my son would die in my arms. My hands were going completely numb as I fumbled with my phone, my stiff fingers barely registering against the wet touchscreen. I opened the ride-sharing app, selected the nearest cheap airport motel, and hit confirm. A red exclamation mark instantly flashed across the screen. Payment declined. My brain, sluggish from the biting cold, struggled to process the message. I quickly switched to my secondary card, the one linked to our primary joint checking account. Declined. With a hammering heart, I forced my shaking thumbs to open my mobile banking application. The screen loaded, revealing a stark, devastating notification. The primary account holder has frozen and restricted all associated cards effective 48 hours ago. Julian had planned this down to the very minute. He had systematically cut off my access to every single dollar we shared 2 full days before throwing me out into the storm, ensuring that I would have absolutely no financial means to survive the night. The sheer, calculated malice of his actions stole whatever breath the freezing mountain wind had not already taken. Just as the darkness of panic began to cloud my vision, 2 bright high beams pierced the blinding sleet. A large, black SUV turned sharply into the driveway, its heavy tires crunching aggressively over the fresh ice. The heavy driver's side door of the black SUV swung open before the vehicle had even come to a complete stop. A tall, broad-shouldered man stepped out into the freezing deluge, his eyes wide with absolute, unadulterated horror as he took in the sight of me crouching on the wet concrete, trying to shield a blue-lipped, shivering infant with my own freezing body. It was Arthur, my 34-year-old childhood friend. Arthur was a highly analytical, senior land use surveyor and property development expert who worked grueling hours at a top-tier regional infrastructure consulting firm downtown, and he was also the operational manager of the Emerald Hills homestay. Unlike Julian and Rosamund, who viewed the land only as a status symbol to exploit, Arthur possessed a working moral compass, always observing their greed and arrogance quietly from the edges. He had been driving home from a late-night site inspection of a nearby conservation easement when he saw the estate gates open and decided to check on us. Arthur did not ask a single unnecessary question. He did not hesitate or worry about crossing Rosamund, the tyrannical matriarch who demanded absolute loyalty and obedience from everyone in her social circle. He stripped off his heavy canvas field coat, threw it over my freezing shoulders, and gently scooped Toby into his massive arms. "Get in the car right now, Serafina," he commanded, guiding my shivering frame toward the warm, idling vehicle. I scrambled into the passenger seat, the blast of the heater hitting my frozen skin like a physical shock wave. Arthur carefully buckled Toby into an emergency car seat he kept in the back, then threw the vehicle into reverse and peeled out of the driveway. He dialed his phone, but quickly pressed end before it could even ring. "No," he muttered, his jaw clenched tight as he gripped the steering wheel. "If I call anyone at the resort, Rosamund will find out within 5 minutes. I am getting you out of this valley completely." He drove us miles away from the affluent foothills, navigating the treacherous, slick mountain roads until we reached a discreet, high-end extended-stay lodge near the city center. Arthur paid for a private suite out of his own pocket, deliberately using a personal business card that Rosamond and Julian could never trace or question. He carried my son up to the room, turned the thermostat up to 80 degrees, and pulled the heavy blackout curtains shut to block out the roaring storm. He handed me a thick wad of emergency cash and a set of key cards. "Do not call Julian, and do not call anyone at the resort," Arthur said, his voice deadly serious as he looked at me. "You stay exactly here. A man who leaves his own wife and sick infant to freeze in a storm is hiding something massive. I am going to find out what he is running from, because a surveyor knows that a desperate man always tries to redraft the boundaries." The moment the door clicked shut, leaving me in the warm, quiet sanctuary of the suite, I laid Toby on the center of the king-sized bed, wrapping him securely in the thick down comforters. His breathing was still slightly ragged, and his skin was extremely flushed from the cold exposure, but he was finally beginning to warm up. A different, freezing kind of energy began to pulse rapidly through my veins. Julian and Rosamond believed they had completely destroyed my life. They thought I was a pathetic, helpless freelance gardener who relied entirely on their family name and homestay wealth to survive. I walked over to the desk, pulled my battered laptop from the bottom of my bag, and plugged it into the wall. I bypassed the hotel's public network, launched a heavily encrypted virtual private network, and entered a secure two-factor authentication code. The screen loaded, revealing a high-priority message from a top-tier international corporate law firm. The subject line read, "Final intellectual property clearance and escrow approval." During the 9 grueling months of my pregnancy, while Julian was out drinking with his country club partners and complaining about my lack of corporate pedigree, I had been locked in my greenhouse office coding and testing. I had used my deep scientific knowledge of soil chemistry and botanical microclimates to program a revolutionary, automated environmental monitoring algorithm for commercial agriculture, a system called Biomatrix V9 that optimized soil health and water conservation by 80% while maintaining absolute ecological data immutability. And the buyer of this technology was none other than the massive, multi-billion-dollar global green tech conglomerate that owned 70% of the supply lines for Julian's own eco-homestay network. The email confirmed that the mandatory 10-day escrow holding period for the acquisition was officially ticking down its final hours. The legal verifications were complete, the signatures were verified, and a wire transfer of $1.5 million was locked in, ready to land directly into my private, unshared corporate account. I stared at the glowing screen, a cold, lethal smile spreading across my face. Julian had thrown me out for being a broke liability, entirely unaware that he had just handed me the absolute freedom to purchase the very ground beneath his feet. The rush of adrenaline from the escrow confirmation was a temporary shield. Just as I closed the legal portal, a sharp, wet rattle fractured the silence of the room. I rushed to the bed. Toby's tiny chest was heaving with rapid, shallow breaths, his skin radiating a terrifying, unnatural heat. The exposure to the freezing rain had compromised his fragile, recovering lungs. I stripped him down, grabbed a stack of clean hotel washcloths, and soaked them in lukewarm water, gently wiping down his feverish body to prevent his tiny system from going into shock. I needed infant medication, a clinical thermometer, and a specialized pediatric nebulizer. But I was terrified to leave him alone for even a second to run to a pharmacy, and my personal checking account sat at a pathetic $12. While I was pacing the floor, rocking my burning child against my bare chest, a sharp, high-pitched chime echoed from my laptop. It was a specialized notification sound I had set up exclusively for Arthur's encrypted secure portal. I hurried to the desk. Arthur had sent a compressed video file accompanied by a short message. I knew he was hiding something, Serafina. Brace yourself. My hands trembled as I clicked play. The video timestamp blinked clearly in the top right corner, exactly 24 hours after Julian had locked me out of the estate. The footage pulled directly from the estate's cloud backup, and Julian's personal vehicle dashcam showed the grand driveway of the Emerald Hills homestay. A sleek, silver sports car pulled up to the entrance, its tires crunching loudly over the freshly plowed sleet. Julian stepped out, wearing an immaculate, custom-tailored coat and a sickeningly bright, eager smile. He rushed around the front of the vehicle to open the passenger door, extending his hand with practiced, chivalrous flair. A woman stepped out. She was glamorous, dripping in effortless, old-money wealth, wearing a pristine white cashmere coat. I recognized her instantly. It was Vanessa Sterling, the youngest daughter of the billionaire CEO who ran Sterling Enterprises, the very conglomerate that held the key to Julian's pending corporate expansion. I watched in absolute disgust as Julian began hauling massive, matching designer luggage up our front steps. This was not a casual visit. Vanessa was moving into my house the very next day. The secondary audio file, pulled from the vehicle's internal cabin microphone, kicked in with crystal clarity. Vanessa paused on the porch, looking slightly hesitant. "Julian, are you absolutely sure about this?" she asked, her voice carrying a delicate, high-society concern. "It all happened so incredibly fast. Where are your wife and the baby?" Julian dropped the luggage and turned to face her, his expression shifting instantly into a mask of deep, manufactured sorrow. "Do not worry about her, Vanessa," Julian lied smoothly, his voice dripping with a practiced, tragic tone that made my stomach turn. "She is a deeply delusional woman." The pressure of motherhood broke her mental stability completely, and she abandoned our son and walked out into the storm in the middle of the night. "I am all those children have now, and having you here is the only thing giving me the strength to get through this horrific nightmare." I sat frozen in the hotel chair, my breath caught in my throat. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of his lie was staggering. He had literally shoved his sick son and wife into a freezing storm, yet less than 24 hours later, he was painting himself as a heroic, grieving single father to win the sympathy of a billionaire's daughter. He didn't just want a quick divorce. He needed me completely erased from the social record so he could seamlessly slide Vanessa into my place, securing his multi-million-dollar corporate partnership and his place in high society. A weak, raspy cough from the bed snapped my attention back to the present. The lingering anxiety and fear of being a broke, single mother vanished completely. In its place rose a cold, calculating, and lethal rage. I looked at the confirmation of the $1.5 million buyout. It was no longer just an escape fund. It was my war chest, and I was going to use it to drop an atomic bomb on Julian's manufactured reality. The rain continued to beat a relentless, rhythmic tattoo against the heavy glass of the hotel's suite window, but inside, the atmosphere had shifted from one of desperate survival to cold, calculated warfare. Arthur sat hunched over his rugged field laptop, which was connected to a portable external hard drive containing thousands of public registry records, GIS mapping data, and land use archives for the entire valley. His sharp, surveyor's eyes scanned the glowing lines of boundary coordinates and historical property transfers. Beside him, I worked on my own screen, periodically checking the encrypted countdown of my agricultural software buyout while monitoring Toby's soft, even breathing on the bed nearby. For 3 hours, the only sounds in the room were the hum of our laptops and the occasional clicking of Arthur's mouse. Suddenly, Arthur stopped typing. He sat back slowly, a look of profound, stunned disbelief washing over his face. He rubbed his eyes, stared back at the screen, and then turned the laptop toward me. "Serafina," Arthur said, his voice dropping to a tense, quiet whisper. "You need to look at this." I was running a standard land title trace on Emerald Hills Homestay, crossing Julian's corporate operating license with the municipal county tax maps. What I found defies everything Julian and Rosamund have been bragging about for the last 4 years. I leaned in, my eyes tracking the colored lines on the digital map. It showed the layout of the homestay, the luxury guest cabins, the main timber lodge, the landscaped gardens, and the winding gravel road that served as the sole entry and exit point for the entire peninsula. "Look at Parcel A," Arthur pointed to a large, green-shaded polygon that ran directly through the center of the property, covering the entire main entrance, the primary driveway, and the pristine, scenic ridge where the administrative lodge and the main septic system were located. This parcel is the absolute heart of the entire development. Without it, the rest of the cabins are completely landlocked, inaccessible, and structurally non-viable. They can't even run their waste systems without this piece of land. "And who owns Parcel A?" I asked, my heart beginning to pulse with a sudden, sharp rhythm. "You do," Arthur declared, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. "It was never part of the Ridgway family estate. This specific plot was registered under your grandfather's old botanical nursery license. When he passed away 5 years ago, he left this specific plot of land directly to you in a private, unrecorded deed that was held in a trust until you reached your 25th birthday. Because you were married to Julian at the time, and because you were focused on designing the gardens, you simply let them build the resort over it without formalizing the boundary lines. Julian's mother, Rosamund, assumed that because it was adjacent to their ancestral hills, it belonged to them. But on paper, the entire entrance and the core infrastructure of Emerald Hills belong entirely to Serafina Vance. I stared at the map, the pieces of the puzzle falling into place with terrifying clarity. Julian and Rosamund had thrown me out, calling me a penniless, low-class gardener who had no right to stand on their land. They believed they held all the power because they controlled the corporate operating license of the resort. They had absolutely no idea that they had built their entire multi-million-dollar empire on a foundation of stolen dirt, and that I held the title deed to the very soil beneath their feet. "But it gets much worse for them," Arthur continued, sliding a secondary folder of spreadsheets onto the screen. "As the operational manager, I've always known Julian was aggressive with expansion, but I didn't know he was desperate." I ran a cross-reference of their corporate credit lines and the secondary mortgages on the rest of the estate, the land that Rosamund actually does own. Julian has leveraged the family properties to the absolute maximum. He took out a massive, high-interest commercial loan 3 months ago, exactly when he began pursuing Vanessa Sterling. "What did he do with the money?" I asked, my eyes narrowing. "No," Arthur said, his voice dripping with disgust. "He spent it on high-end, rapidly depreciating assets to trick Vanessa into believing he belongs in her elite billionaire social circle." I tracked the routing numbers of his personal spending. He purchased a brand-new silver sports car, under a dummy corporation to hide the liability from the business books. He bought custom diamond jewelry, chartered private flights for weekend getaways, and paid for reservations at exclusive, thousands of dollars a night resorts. He manufactured a billionaire persona out of thin air, completely financed by fraudulent commercial debt. "He is trying to buy his way into the Sterling family," I murmured, a cold realization settling over me. "He thinks that if he can just marry Vanessa quickly enough, her family's unimaginable wealth will automatically wipe out his catastrophic financial ruin." "Exactly," Arthur affirmed. "But to keep the illusion alive until the wedding, he needed immediate cash. And since the banks cut off his credit lines last week due to non-payment, he found another source of capital. He forged his mother's signature on a power of attorney document 6 months ago, granting himself unrestricted access to Rosamund's private retirement portfolio. He has systematically drained her municipal bonds, liquidated her cash reserves, and transferred the funds in irregular batches to his personal account. Rosamund is completely bankrupt, Serafina. Her remaining assets are illegally leveraged against Julian's failing dummy corporations. When the creditors realize the money is gone, they aren't just going to foreclose on Julian's cabins, they are going to seize Rosamund's ancestral home and everything she owns. I sat back in my chair, the silence of the hotel room becoming heavy and electric. Julian and Rosamund had spent years treating me like a parasite, yet Julian was the ultimate financial parasite, willing to destroy his own mother, discard his wife, and endanger his sick infant just to maintain a fleeting, fraudulent illusion of power. "We have them, Serafina," Arthur said, his eyes shining with a dangerous determination. "We have the land titles, and we have the proof of corporate embezzlement. We can go to the judge at the emergency custody hearing on Friday, present this entire forensic audit, and bury Julian alive. The court will never let a bankrupt, fraudulent criminal take custody of Toby." "No," I said softly, my voice cold and steady. "We aren't just going to stop him in a quiet, sterile courtroom, Arthur. Julian and Rosamund want to play a grand, theatrical game. They want to parade their stolen wealth and celebrate their new life in front of the entire city. So we are going to let them." I looked at my phone, where the digital clock was ticking down the final hours of my software's holding period. The $1.5 million from my green tech acquisition would clear into my private account long before the weekend. "Let Julian have his meetings," I continued, a slow, calculated smile spreading across my face. "Let him plan his lavish future with Vanessa. Because when the clock runs out, I am going to buy the defaulted debt on their remaining properties, block the entrance to their resort, and reclaim every single square inch of my land in front of the very people they have spent their entire lives trying to impress." The emergency custody hearing at the county courthouse on Friday morning felt like entering a cold, wood-paneled arena where the weapons of choice were paper, pedigree, and manufactured lies. I sat at the petitioner's table, my back straight, dressed in a simple, dark gray linen blazer Arthur had helped me purchase. Beside me sat a local, sharp-eyed family law attorney whom Arthur's business networks had recommended. She was a woman who didn't care about social standing, she cared about technicalities. Across the aisle, Julian sat looking every bit the grieving, upper-class father. He wore a crisp, tailored navy suit, his hair perfectly coiffed, a single gold-framed photograph of Toby resting conspicuously on his table. Flanking him was a high-priced corporate litigator from the city's most prestigious firm, a man whose hourly rate could have paid for my son's medical care for a year. Behind them sat Rosamund, her face an unyielding mask of high society superiority. She looked at me with a slow, pitying shake of her head, as if my very presence in the room was a distasteful joke. Judge, a stern, pragmatic woman named Gwendolyn Vance, reviewed the case files with a practiced, heavy sigh. "Mr. Ridgway," Judge Vance began, looking over her glasses at Julian's attorney. "Your petition claims that the mother, Serafina Vance, is currently homeless, lacking any stable source of income, and has acted in a manner that directly endangered the physical safety of your 4-month-old son, Toby. You are requesting immediate, sole temporary physical and legal custody. Is that correct?" Julian's attorney stood up, smoothing his jacket with practiced elegance. "That is correct, Your Honor. My client was horrified when, in the middle of a torrential storm, his wife suffered a severe mental and emotional collapse. She fled the Emerald Hills estate, taking their fragile infant into a freezing deluge, completely cutting off all communication. When we finally tracked her down, she had admitted the child to a local pediatric clinic under highly suspicious circumstances, with no means to pay the medical invoice. We have submitted affidavits from the hospital staff confirming that the infant was suffering from acute respiratory inflammation due to cold exposure. He was exposed because Julian threw us out, my attorney Sarah countered, standing up quickly. We have evidence that the father manually deactivated his wife's and son's health insurance policy within hours of forcing them out of the house in sub-zero temperatures. He attempted to use the child's medical crisis as financial leverage to force a custody surrender. Julian's attorney let out a soft, patronizing chuckle. Your Honor, that is a highly dramatic and completely unsubstantiated claim. My client's corporate policy underwent a standard, automated administrative review due to his pending corporate restructuring. It was a technical glitch, nothing more. Furthermore, my client's mother, Lady Rosamond, has already set up a fully funded trust and hired a private, licensed pediatric nurse to ensure Toby receives round-the-clock, premium care at the family estate. Meanwhile, the mother has yet to provide a single bank statement, a valid lease, or any proof of employment to show she can even buy a container of infant formula. Judge Vance turned her sharp, evaluating gaze toward me. Ms. Vance, in custody disputes, the court's primary and absolute priority is the immediate stability and welfare of the child. While I understand there are high emotions here, the physical reality is that you are currently residing in a temporary hotel suite funded by a third party. You have no documented active income, and your joint accounts have been frozen pending the divorce proceedings. Can you show this court any concrete, legally binding evidence of a stable, safe environment and the financial means to support your son? I looked down at the mahogany table. I felt Sarah's hand tighten on my arm, signaling me to stay calm. Under the table, my fingers clutched my phone. The clock was ticking. It was 10:15 a.m. on Friday. According to my secure portal, the legal holding period for the Biomatrix V9 software acquisition was scheduled to officially close at exactly 12 p.m. today. If I spoke of the $1.5 million and now, if I presented the unverified escrow documents to the judge before the final clearance hour, Julian's legal team would immediately flag the transaction. They would claim the intellectual property was marital property, freeze the funds under an injunction, and tie my life up in litigation for the next 5 years. I cannot present a lease agreement today, Your Honor, I said, keeping my voice soft, letting a tremulous, defeated tone creep into my words. But I am actively seeking housing, and I have a close friend who is supporting us. Rosamond let out a soft, audible scoff from the gallery. Julian leaned forward, his face a picture of tragic, forced sympathy. Your Honor, I love my wife, but she is simply not in a position to handle this. I am not trying to keep Toby away from her forever. I just want my son to be safe, warm and cared for at Emerald Hills while Serafina gets the psychological and financial help she so clearly needs. Judge Vance looked at the documents, her pen hovering over the order. Given the immediate lack of verified housing and income, the court has no choice but to prioritize the physical stability of the infant. However, due to the conflicting reports regarding the deactivation of the health insurance, I am not comfortable granting an absolute ex parte transfer today. I am issuing a temporary, 48-hour emergency placement order. The infant will remain in the temporary care of the mother under the direct supervision of the court-appointed guardian ad litem until Monday morning. At that time, we will reconvene. Ms. Vance, if you do not have a signed lease and verified proof of independent income by 9 a.m. on Monday, I will sign the order transferring full physical custody to the father. Julian's jaw tightened. He wanted Toby today. He needed the child in his arms to show off to Vanessa and Marcus Sterling at the Grand Gala tomorrow night, but he quickly masked his anger, offering a polite, humble bow to the judge. Thank you, Your Honor. Julian said smoothly. I look forward to resolving this on Monday. As the courtroom began to empty, Julian walked slowly past my table. He paused, leaning down so close I could smell his expensive cologne. You played a good hand, Serafina, he whispered, his voice a cold, predatory purr. But you're out of chips. Enjoy your last weekend with my son. Because on Monday, I am taking him back, and I am going to make sure you never see him again. I looked up, my eyes locking onto his with a gaze that was colder than the mountain ice. You should worry less about my weekend, Julian, I said, my voice entirely flat, and start worrying about your own. The moment we stepped outside the heavy limestone doors of the courthouse, the damp, gray Boston air felt like a physical weight. Arthur was waiting by his SUV, his face tense with anticipation. He didn't ask how it went. He could read the timeline on my face. We have 48 hours, Arthur, I said as we got into the vehicle. The judge gave us until Monday morning. If I don't have a lease and a verified income by then, she signs Toby over to Julian. Arthur threw the car into drive, his hands gripping the steering wheel. Then we don't have a single second to waste. The escrow clears in less than an hour, right? I checked my phone. Exactly 35 minutes. Perfect, Arthur said, a grim, professional determination in his voice. Because while you were in that courtroom, I was pulling the final pieces of the public land use registry. I didn't just find the boundary lines of your grandfather's nursery, Serafina. I found the financial leverage we need to pull the rug out from under Julian's entire empire. We drove back to the hotel suite in absolute, focused silence. The moment we walked through the door, I rushed to the bedroom to check on Toby. He was sleeping peacefully, his tiny cheeks warm and pink under the hotel blankets. I kissed his forehead, then walked back into the living area and sat down at the desk with Arthur. Show me, I said, opening my laptop. Arthur spun his screen around, displaying a highly detailed structural diagram of the Emerald Hills homestay. Julian's primary commercial loan, the one he took out to finance his sports cars and his luxury lifestyle for Vanessa, was secured using the physical structures of the homestay as collateral. But here is the critical legal error Julian made. Because he and Rosamond assumed they owned the entire property, they listed the main reception lodge, the central parking lot, and the primary utility lines as part of the bank's security package. But those structures are built on my parcel, I realized, my eyes widening as the legal implications clicked into place. Exactly. Arthur slammed his hand on the desk in triumph. Under state property law, a borrower cannot use land they do not own as collateral for a commercial loan without the explicit, notarized signature of the actual title holder. Julian forged your name on the easement consents, but he didn't realize that the bank's underwriting department kept a digital copy of the original title deed in their secure archive. I contacted a senior title auditor I work with at the county registry. The moment they cross-referenced the coordinates, they realized the bank's collateral package is completely invalid. The loan is technically unsecured. Which means the bank is about to call the loan, Arthur explained, his voice rising with excitement. They are going to declare Julian in default for technical fraud. They have already initiated the foreclosure process on the remaining cabins, the ones that are actually built on Rosamond's land. But because those cabins are landlocked by your parcel, the bank knows they can't sell them to anyone else. The bank is desperate to cut their losses. How much is the defaulted debt? I asked, my heart hammering a fierce, electric rhythm. $1.2 million, Arthur said, looking directly into my eyes. And because the bank wants to avoid a massive, public legal scandal involving forgery, they are willing to sell the entire outstanding debt package to a private investment entity for pennies on the dollar. They just want to wash their hands of the Ridgway family. I looked at the digital clock in the corner of my screen. 11:59 a.m. I held my breath, my fingers hovering over the trackpad. At exactly 12:10 p.m., the screen refreshed automatically. The secure legal portal flashed a bright, emerald green notification: transaction completed, escrow disbursed. I quickly opened my private, unshared corporate banking application. The screen loaded, displaying a balance that made my breath catch in my throat: $1,500,000. The money was there. It was real, it was clean, and it was entirely mine. "Arthur," I said, my voice dropping to a whisper of absolute, lethal certainty, "contact the bank's title auditor right now. Tell them a private holding company, Vance Green Developments, is prepared to purchase the entire defaulted debt package of Emerald Hills Homestay for cash, with an immediate, wire-transferred settlement. I want the deed of trust and the foreclosure rights transferred to my name by 5 o'clock this afternoon." Arthur's eyes went wide, a slow, stunned laugh escaping his lips. "You're going to buy his debt." "I'm going to buy his debt, I'm going to buy his mother's house, and I am going to block the only road into his precious resort," I said, my eyes burning with a cold, unyielding light. "But we aren't going to tell him yet. Tomorrow night is the grand anniversary gala at the Ritz-Carlton. Julian is planning to announce his partnership with Sterling Enterprises and his engagement to Vanessa. He thinks he is about to secure his place in the elite class." I closed my laptop with a soft, definitive snap. "We are going to let him dress up. We are going to let him raise his glass. And then, we are going to pull the ground right out from under his feet." The grand ballroom of the Ritz-Carlton was a cathedral of manufactured prestige. Under the towering crystal chandeliers, the city's elite drifted through a sea of velvet and silk, their laughter echoing softly against the gold-leafed ceilings. It was Saturday night, the pinnacle of Julian's meticulously constructed illusion. The air was thick with the scent of expensive floral arrangements and vintage champagne, paid for entirely with the hollowed-out remains of Rosamond's looted retirement accounts. Julian stood at the center of the room, looking every bit the triumphant corporate savior. Clad in a bespoke midnight black tuxedo, he held a crystal flute of champagne, his face radiating an arrogant, untouchable warmth. Vanessa Sterling clung to his arm, her designer gown shimmering under the lights, her fingers showcasing a massive, flawless diamond engagement ring that represented yet another line of Julian's defaulted, fraudulent credit. Beside them stood Vanessa's father, Marcus Sterling, the legendary, self-made green tech billionaire whose global conglomerate held the keys to the entire shipping and logistics market. Julian was in the middle of pitching his grand expansion plan for Emerald Hills, his voice dripping with smooth, practiced confidence. "Our expansion model is simple, Marcus," Julian said, gesturing with his glass. "We are integrating luxury ecotourism with high-end environmental preservation. Emerald Hills is just the first step. With Sterling Tech's backing, we can scale this boutique model across the entire Pacific Northwest. It's an ironclad investment." Rosamond stood close by, nodding eagerly, her neck draped in diamonds that were currently securing a collapsing house of cards. "Julian has inherited our family's vision for land development, Marcus. He knows exactly how to identify high-value assets and maximize their yield. The Ridgeway legacy is in excellent hands." Marcus Sterling listened quietly, his sharp, evaluating eyes scanning Julian's face with a quiet, unreadable intensity. Julian smiled, puffing out his chest, utterly convinced that his performance was flawless, and that his ex-wife was currently weeping in a public shelter, defeated and broken. Suddenly, the heavy, double mahogany doors at the back of the ballroom were thrust apart. The chatter in the room died down, a ripple of silent confusion washing over the crowd. I stepped over the threshold, letting the doors fall shut behind me with a final, echoing click. I was draped in an immaculate, floor-length gown of deep emerald silk, a masterpiece of structured, minimalist tailoring that radiated a quiet, commanding luxury, making the surrounding sea of bright sequins look utterly cheap. My hair was swept up, exposing the sharp, confident line of my jaw. Flanking me on either side were two top-tier corporate litigators from the city's most formidable firm, carrying identical, thick leather folders. From across the vast ballroom, I locked eyes with Julian. The triumphant, arrogant smile melted off his face in real time, replaced instantly by an expression of pure, unadulterated shock. Beside him, Rosamund's face paled, her hands trembling so violently that her champagne glass rattled against her silver tray. Julian gripped Rosamund's arm and began a rapid, aggressive march across the ballroom floor to intercept me before I could reach the central tables. "What in the hell do you think you are doing here, Serafina?" Julian hissed, his voice a desperate, quiet venom as he looked around to ensure none of the nearby investors could hear. "You are trespassing. I don't care how you rented that dress, but if you do not turn around and walk out of those doors right now, I will have the Ritz security drag you out into the street." Rosamund sneered, her voice trembling with aristocratic rage. "Did you think you'd come here and embarrass us, you pathetic little gardener? You are a destitute nobody who is 48 hours away from losing her child. Security, have this woman removed." I did not flinch, I did not raise my voice. I merely looked at them with a calm, freezing detachment. Before the security guards could step forward, Marcus Sterling approached, his heavy, purposeful stride cutting through the parting crowd. Julian quickly smoothed his lapels, desperately trying to regain control of the room. "Marcus, I am so incredibly sorry for this disturbance. My ex-wife she is suffering from a very severe, unstable mental condition. She has been stalking us since the separation. I'm having security quietly handle it." Marcus Sterling did not look at Julian. He walked straight past him, brushing past his shoulder as if he were nothing more than a piece of empty space, and stopped directly in front of me. A warm, genuine smile of profound respect spread across the billionaire's face as he extended his hand. "Serafina," Marcus said, his deep voice carrying effortlessly across the silent room, "I was beginning to worry you wouldn't make the reception. The final legal clearance went through at noon yesterday. The board is absolutely thrilled." The entire ballroom fell into a suffocating, dead silence. Julian's mouth opened, but no sound came out, his body locking up as he stared at the billionaire bowing respectfully to the woman he had thrown into the rain. Marcus Sterling turned to face the crowd, raising his glass. "Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to introduce you to the true guest of honor tonight. As of yesterday at noon, Sterling Enterprises has officially acquired the exclusive global rights to the Biometrics V9 ecological monitoring software for a cash buyout of $1.5 million. And the brilliant agricultural software architect who developed this game-changing technology did not just take our cash, she negotiated a major equity stake. Please join me in welcoming Serafina Vance, the newest executive partner of Sterling Tech, and our leading strategist for land development." A loud murmur of astonished whispers erupted through the crowd. Julian's knees visibly buckled, his hand gripping the edge of a nearby dessert table to keep from collapsing. Rosamund looked as if she had been struck by lightning, her eyes darting between my emerald gown and the smiling billionaire. I stepped forward, gesturing to my lead litigator, who opened his leather portfolio and laid a thick stack of certified, notarized documents on the table directly in front of Marcus Sterling and Vanessa. "What is this, Serafina?" Marcus asked, his tone shifting to one of sharp, professional caution. "These are the certified land title registries for Emerald Hills Homestay, Marcus," I said, my voice ringing out with absolute, clear authority. "Julian has spent the last 4 years pitching Emerald Hills as a premier, luxury eco-resort. What he neglected to mention to you, and to his investors, is that the entire entrance, the primary driveway, the main administrative lodge, and the central utility lines are built on Parcel A, a plot of land that belongs entirely and exclusively to me, inherited through my grandfather's private trust. Vanessa gasped, grabbing the documents from the table, her eyes scanning the official red-lined property maps. Furthermore, I continued, looking directly at Julian's sweating, pale face, your future son-in-law is completely bankrupt. To fund his lavish lifestyle and buy his way into your social circle, Julian forged my signature to secure a high-interest commercial loan using my land as collateral. When the underwriting bank audited the title yesterday morning, they realized the collateral was fraudulent. The bank immediately declared the loan in default. You're lying, Julian stammered, his voice cracking. Marcus, don't listen to her. My family has owned those hills for generations. The bank didn't think I was lying, Julian, I said, a cold, sharp smile playing on my lips. In fact, they were so eager to avoid a massive forgery scandal that yesterday afternoon, they sold your entire defaulted debt package directly to my private holding company Vance Green Developments. I am now your primary creditor, and as of 5 o'clock yesterday, I have initiated immediate foreclosure proceedings on the remaining cabins. I stepped closer to Julian, my eyes locking onto his with a lethal intensity. The road leading into Emerald Hills is officially closed, Julian. I've already had Arthur park our heavy construction vehicles across the entry gates on my parcel. You have no resort. You have no access. You have nothing but $1 million in unsecured, fraudulent debt. Vanessa stared at the papers, her face turning a sickly, translucent white. She turned to Julian, her voice rising in a shrill scream. You forged signatures. You leveraged your own mother's properties to buy me a ring with stolen money. You're a fraud. With a violent motion, Vanessa tore the massive diamond ring off her finger and hurled it directly at Julian's face. It struck his cheekbone and clattered loudly onto the polished floor, rolling into the shadows. Marcus Sterling's expression turned into one of pure, unadulterated fury. He stepped forward and brought his heavy hand down across Julian's jaw with a brutal, echoing slap that sent Julian crashing sideways into a tower of champagne glasses, sending them shattering across the floor in a waterfall of gold, liquid, and broken crystal. The merger is cancelled, Marcus growled, his voice a low, terrifying rumble. And I am calling the district attorney's office myself to report this wire fraud. Get this garbage out of my sight. Before Julian could even drag himself up from the wet floor, a phalanx of uniformed police officers, whom Arthur had escorted to the Ritz-Carlton entrance, marched into the ballroom. They grabbed Julian by his arms, hauled him to his feet, and snapped cold, heavy steel handcuffs around his wrists, dragging him out of the room in front of every major investor in the city. I turned slowly to face Rosamund, who was trembling in her chair, looking older than she ever had in her life. I pulled a final, sealed document from my litigator's folder and placed it gently in her lap. The ancestral home is also cross-collateralized under Julian's defaulted loan, Rosamund, I said, my voice steady and cold. The foreclosure notice is stapled to the front. You have exactly 48 hours to pack your clothes into a single suitcase and vacate my property. If you are still there on Monday morning, I will have the local sheriff drag you out into the dirt, exactly the way you threw my son's medical equipment into the mud. Monday morning. The wood-paneled courtroom was quiet. Judge Gwendolyn Vance looked over her glasses as my attorney presented the certified copy of my newly funded corporate bank statement, showing a cleared balance of $1.5 million, alongside a signed long-term lease for a luxury estate in the valley. Given the sudden, catastrophic shift in the father's financial and legal standing, Judge Vance declared, her gavel resting in her hand. The court finds that the father is entirely unfit and unable to provide a safe, stable environment. I am signing the permanent, sole physical and legal custody order of Toby Vance to the mother, effective immediately. This court is adjourned. 2 years later, the green hills of the valley were peaceful. The Emerald Hills Resort had been entirely dismantled, its commercial cabins sold off to pay the creditors. In its place, the land had been returned to its natural, wild beauty, with my new botanical research greenhouse sitting at the very center, bathed in the warm morning sun. Toby, now a healthy, laughing toddler with bright, clear eyes, ran through the rows of blooming organic flora chasing Arthur, who was carrying a wooden crate of fresh soil. I stood on the porch of our newly built timber home, holding a warm cup of tea, watching them with a deep, peaceful smile. The cold winter storm was finally over. I had realized that true family isn't about a prestigious name, a shared deed, or the blood in your veins. True family are the ones who stand by you in the blinding sleet, who lend you their coat when you are freezing, and who help